Well, thank you all. So in the great tradition of Swiss democracy, we're going to have a lot of Q&A. Just to make sure you're not shy, we have a poll. Maybe we could put it up there. Maybe? No? Yes? They should see it? There it is. Okay. So I just, we thought we brainstormed a bit, like first topic to keep things rolling. If you go to the same web page that you saw before, let me remind you, it was uzh.voting/UBSC. Okay. Then if you go there, you will see that there are three options for a question to our panels, which will show up in about 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. No? Yes. Okay. And we kind of touched on the first one. I'm a bit less scared from the machines after this encouraging speech. But one would be the impact of automation on corporate culture, how we should cope with that and how it's going to affect. Second thing, if you've been following the news, the UN released its climate change review a few weeks ago, and we're basically facing an imminent crisis according to that review. So how do we think about corporate culture, environmental and social responsibility? And then, again, all these topics were touched in the last discussion specifically, and then diversity in corporate culture, and the issues of cost, benefits, how to think about those. So I'm going to give you a few seconds to vote. Whatever is going to be the most voted topic, we'll go for an open discussion here, and after that we're going to go with more traditional, less automated Q&A. Okay? And if it's completely equal, we'll randomize, which is the favorite word of economists. Okay, so maybe we can see the results. Okay, the machines are coming. So, Simona, you touched on that. If you want to elaborate on that, or maybe Raffaella or Ernst, let's feel it a free discussion. Maybe Raffaella, if you want to start.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
So, remind me the question, effect of automation.
The effect of automation, digitization, we're in this fourth industrial revolution. Yeah. How do we think that's going to affect corporate culture in a world where,
Actually, I thought about it from a research standpoint. My view has always been how corporate culture actually mediates the effect of information technology. And the reason for that, I think that there is a misconception that, IT adoption, for example, or the adoption of new technologies more generally are really an issue of just plugging the machines in the wall and everything happening. Well, it turns out that we know what happened during the PC revolution, and I think we have a sense that this is happening now too. In order for technologies to work, you need a tremendous amount of organizational change. And in prior research, for example, we've looked at the different ways in which companies reacted to how they adjusted to the first wave of the digital revolution in the 90s. And it was apparent that companies that were more flexible had a better notion of what it means to change roles, take care of those that were maybe being pushed out, maybe retraining and all that. Those companies were able to extract much more out of their technological investments relative to companies that were more rigid. So I think in the sense of what you said before, I truly agree that when it comes, when you have to deal with unforeseen changes or even changes that are foreseeable but require adjustments, that's when culture really matters, because it provides a sense of security to the ones. There's tremendous anxiety associated with change, and culture can placate that anxiety. Yeah.
So I have some thoughts on this. Well, two things. I mean, the digitalization has some advantages, potential advantages, and poses potential dangers. Now, with regard to the advantages, I think it's good to keep in mind that because of digitalization, because a lot occurs on the web, many companies have started to run experiments, basically, with us as consumers, for example. I mean, Google is conducting, you don't notice that, but they are we are all laboratory rats. When we go on the internet and go to Google, they conduct experiments with us in the thousands every day. The same is happening with Amazon, the same is happening on Facebook. So what they do is they learn about our behaviors by looking at how we behave. And because we do this on the internet, it's very cheap for them to collect this data. And what that means is that, and many other companies lag behind. So there is this, most companies that were not, I mean, all these companies I was talking about, they're just 15 years old or 10 years. But all the older companies, they are not they don't have the culture of what we call experimentability. So they are not able to run these experiments, to discover the behaviors in an easy way via their web platforms. And so I think a huge opportunity for many firms is to become able to run experiments. What that means is basically, I mean, when I was showing you my experiments in my previous talk, what we do is we randomly assign people to treatment and control, like a pharmaceutical company does it when they give a placebo in a treatment. And that's the best way to find out. That's what Google does when they search, where do I place my ad? What is the message that I have to use? What is the words and what is the labels? And in the same way, companies have not exploited these huge opportunities that are out there by running experiments on the internet with their customers, with the people who are their stakeholders. Now, this is one thing. There's a huge opportunity out there that could be taken up by the companies. The other thing is that digitalization also poses threats in the following way. I mean, I already cited one of these research projects by Professor Marischal from the University of Zurich, where they study honesty around the globe. Now, they have another research project that is very interesting, which is, are we less willing to remain honest when we interact not with a person on the other side, but with a machine? So when I, for example, call a company, often a machine answers, okay? And what they discover is that people are much more willing to cheat, they are much more willing to lie if on the other side is a machine. So basically that means there are also threats to our social norms that arise through the digital age, okay? So these are just two examples. And now the question is, how do we deal with that again, okay? How do we solve this problem? So both issues are related to corporate culture. The first one, experimentability, is, are the companies flexible enough to introduce these tools that are important to run these experiments? And are these corporate cultures flexible enough? And the second question is, how do we deal with the threats that are coming in through digitalization?
Well, if I can just add one thing to what I was saying, culture is super important, and it will be the solution to the transformation that derives from digitalization. Because there is also a threat if you don't leverage on culture. Digitalization can be really disruptive. In fact, all of us, we need to unlearn everything that we have learned so far and relearn. So you need to have a compass, and your company culture gives you this compass, because everything else will be changing, and you need to be ready to face this change. So I strongly believe that going forward for companies, but for society at large, leveraging on values will be very, very important.
Thank you. So we're going to open the floor now. If there are any questions, there's the lady back there.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm from UBS. I run the diversity and inclusion agenda here for Labor Market Switzerland. My question is, how long does it take for a corporate culture to, quote, change? So if you start as a badly managed bad culture, do you have a chance, or do you experience death like Enron did with its bad culture? And you hear stories of Amazon and Netflix and Uber and these kind of badly managed or badly, at least from an outside viewpoint, from an employee value proposition, egregious behaviors of some of these companies. Because when I hear Ms. Folio's research about beliefs over time, you would think that even badly managed cultured companies have a chance to kind of redeem themselves or get to a better place. So anybody on the panel, thank you very much.
Well, I can tell you a little bit about my research, how quickly social norms can change and how quickly you can establish them and maintain them. Now, we have to keep in mind that for most of the social norms that we have in our society, I mean, by definition, when there is a social norm, there is a sanction for deviance. And this is the reason why sometimes it takes decades and maybe centuries for some norms to change. So it takes a lot of time. But this is due to the fact that there's always a sanctioning system intact, and the sanctioning system has to unravel as well, for example, when we want to replace a bad social norm by a better social norm. Now, companies are, in a sense, in a better position than society as a whole, in my view, because companies can solve the problem from the top and from the bottom at the same time. We have seen companies going through a period of crisis. I mean, one example that comes to my mind is Siemens, when they had these corruption scandals at Siemens. I mean, basically, they solved the problem within 1 or 2 years, in my view. And because they recognized the problem, they took action, they implemented new values, and they looked that they could distribute it over the whole globe, so to speak, in a very diverse way. So I believe that depending on the challenge you face, if this is a grand challenge, it takes maybe a year or two. If it's smaller issues, like, for example, sometimes in companies, it may be the case that people are not orderly enough, or there is disorder, for example, at the workplace. These are smaller issues that you can get rid of much quicker, or that they take too long breaks, or whatever, or whatever the behavioral problem is. These behavioral problems you can change within weeks, in my view, or weeks at least, I believe. Whereas the bigger issue, when you have a bigger problem where you are penetrated by wrong cultural values, then it takes longer. I mean, one particular challenge is and this is the third question here, is diversity. I mean, what does a company do that does business in a country, for example? We have seen this morning, China is very high on positive reciprocity. What is positive reciprocity? Well, positive reciprocity is gift giving. I give you a gift, you are grateful, we reciprocate all the time. But gift giving is also very close to corruption sometimes, you know. And so, but if that is deeply ingrained in a culture, people don't think this is something bad. So, and here is a huge challenge for a company. How does it, for example, pharmaceutical companies, it's very hard for pharmaceutical companies to resist the temptation to not give the doctors gifts such that they prescribe their medicine. Now, how do you do if that is the rule? I must say, I haven't studied that deep enough to give you a real solution to that problem. That seems to be very hard if you are operating in a country where you have very deep-seated values that do many good things. Positive reciprocity is something that is very good in many instances. You know, it enhances cooperation within the company, it enhances cooperation in society, but it has also these negative side effects. And I don't know exactly how to deal with that, to be honest. Yeah.
I think Raffaella wanted to...
Yeah, on the management, I cannot talk about big scandals, but in my research I actually deal with this issue of managerial incompetence, right? And for me it was really revealing because we asked the managers to rate themselves on a scale from 1 to 10. And I want to ask the audience, what do you think the model answer was once we asked managers to rate themselves?
9.
You've read the research. 8, okay? And that score is totally uncorrelated with our score, which is a little bit more objective, and with the financial performance of the company. So this is just to say, I think one big problem that companies face is that they realize that the problem is there too late. And that's due to probably behavioral biases in terms of thinking that what you're doing is, is up to the standards, failing to recognize where your gaps are. So that if there is one piece that can be addressed, is that one. The second piece is that change is possible. you see it. To some extent, selection is healthy. So if Enron goes out of business, perhaps that's part of how the business world works. But change is also possible. It helps to have healthy and competitive markets for that change to happen, which is a bit of an unpopular view these days. But to the extent that you want to change, I see there, again, a big role for leadership in sort of communicating the urgency and doing it in a consistent fashion over time. But you definitely see it happening. It's hard, but it's possible.
What I couldn't say better than that, but what I wanted to add, in a change process, it's very important to spend enough time on awareness. And today, this is the challenge. Everything is so fast-paced that sometimes we replicate behaviors that were even successful in the past, and maybe they're completely unsuccessful now, even dangerous. So the encouragement for me would be to take the proper time. It doesn't take a century, but to become aware of what you're doing, why you're doing, and where you're going before starting the change.
You're not allowed to ask her to rate herself as a manager, though, okay?
I'm curious to know what happens to a company's culture when the company uses a variety of different digital platforms and practices radical openness and inclusion. So this outside-in focus, what happens to the culture? To what extent does it change and how fast?
Well, a lot happens. Now today we are working, so I work in a company that is in retail, right? So retail has been heavily impacted by digitalization. All of a sudden, we don't sell anymore on a physical place. We sell in different places. The physical place is still there, and but we have different channels, from the internet, mobile. We have pickup points through the phone, a variety. And this has also, of course, impacted the way we work in terms of organization, but more profoundly has changed and will have to change even further the way we meet our customers, because customers don't think in channels, they think the brand. So the brand needs to be there, trustworthy and reliable, but also the experience in the store needs to change dramatically. What we are now doing is that when it was enough before to look and see the goods and touch them and pick them up, today is not needed anymore. You can do it from home, from your sofa, and you don't get the 2 hours back and forth from home. So the store needs to become a meeting place where people either learn something or have fun, or even socialize. So it becomes like, if I can use this metaphor, a physical, the physical counterpart of the social platforms.
Very good. Please.
So I think I was signaled up here. Upstairs, you have to watch up here to your right from the podium.
Oh, yeah. Hey.
Sorry.
My name is Jean-Michel. I used to be a student here, currently working at Baloise Group. And arguably some of the most successful companies nowadays are those that are at least being perceived as being the most innovative ones. So take Amazon and the Chinese counterparts, Alibaba and so on. And if you look into that business of innovation, what you often hear is, of course, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And you hear about the innovation culture. So can you say anything about that, any of you?
Okay. No. Yeah, you can go.
Well, I think there is no innovation culture without the culture that tolerates errors and allows for trial and errors. And I think this leads me back to my initial statement about the prospects of digitalization, because when the management has to make decisions, they have to do this very often on a poor evidentiary basis. I mean, this is perhaps something that characterizes a good manager, that this person is able to make decisions sometimes they say it's their gut feeling, but they make decisions. They kind of have the ability to grasp the important aspects very quickly, even when the evidence base is not so good. But of course, even better is it if you have evidence, okay? And evidence, you can, on the internet, you can so easily, through the experiments, gather evidence by running, let's say, this marketing campaign versus this marketing campaign, by randomizing it, and know what works better. You know it, and what that means is you allow for a little error, because in some spot of your of the globe you have run an experiment where you used the wrong method for 3 months, but then you can roll out the right method on a global basis. And I think innovation, and what that means is allow for experimentation, and experimentation means that you also make necessarily some errors. And because you allow for errors, you also allow for more creativity, I believe. People come up with more proposals because they are not afraid that they are punished when they make errors. And I think this is the case when you look at companies like Google. There's a lot of creativity that is generated, and then there is competition among the best ideas. So I think, yeah, that would be my statement.
Yeah, 3 brief comments. Innovation is not only about high tech. No? It can also be a very simple, down-to-earth innovation. We did innovate a lot when we went for the flat packs and the distribution of the products, as we did in the beginning. The second thing is that, for sure, we need to be able to live with mistakes and learn from them. So the drill now would be test, fail fast, and learn from it. And what is working, instead you implement and escalate. And the third point, in terms of mentality, we should put good over speed over perfect. So don't wait to be perfect, because you will be obsolete. But of course, don't do anything in a sloppy way, because it has to be good enough. So it's a new challenge, I would say.
I would say the only thing I would add to this is that there is, I think, a false dichotomy between being innovative and being well managed. And actually, going back to the data that I just showed you, these 2 things can go hand in hand. And I think for very good reasons. Innovation is becoming increasingly more complex. There is a need to bring together different expertise and different competencies. And unless you have a way for this data to be collected, disseminated, and shared and acted upon, it's going to be very hard to tap into this dispersed knowledge. Right now, we are doing a project, I don't know when it's going to come out. It's one of those experiments where it's a new project where we're measuring management practices in clinical research labs in Harvard. And the reason we did that is because scientists and scientists in general, I think, hate management. They hate it with all their guts. They feel it as something that constrains their creativity. Well, it turns out, at least in our data, there is no contradiction between using processes and doing more impactful research. This is all preliminary, but I think that that's one of the challenges. And going forward, what you need is probably scientists or creative people also being good managers for that model to be realized. You need to have a confluence of skills.
I have a question about corporate culture we are discussing all the time. Whenever there is a joint venture or whenever there's a merger and acquisition, do 2 countries, the possible or the probable partners, do some analysis on the cultural compatibility of both the companies in the framework of the due diligence? They usually take care of all those quantifiable parameters, but I wonder if they do this kind of studies and if these are published. Thank you.
Let me just follow up on that. I think it's a great question. It relates to the example of China and gifts. We're in Switzerland, which is a hub for international firms. We have IKEA, we're in the UBS event. So how do we think about this global corporate culture when we're involving different countries, which was the main topic of this morning, about different cultures across countries? How do we balance those things in the case of merger and acquisition?
Well, my view is there are some values that are you cannot compromise them. I mean, for example, in some countries, it's your obligation to help your family members. And so if you become the CEO of a company, let's say in some African country, then everybody in your environment expects that you help them, that you bring them into the job. Now, an international company cannot tolerate that. That leads to inefficiency and is a total disaster. I take these examples from Kaspar Villiger, who has experience when he was sitting in boards about that. So this is an example. So what I want to say, so there are some values that are, and some criteria you cannot compromise. Now, then there are other aspects, like how do people perceive particular things, for example, even symbols, you know? For example, a symbol, how do you give optimal feedback? You know, in some countries you do it like this, okay, and you give negative feedback like this, but in some countries this is totally rude and you can't do that. So you have a symbolic language that is culture specific, and if you don't respect this language, you make terrible errors. So in this sense, you have to take into account cultural specificity in how we perceive things, what words people use, how they express things. For example, in the way when you come from Germany and you notice that people are not fully convinced what you're saying, then they might say, this is interesting but special, okay? So they have a very different way of expressing their disagreement from like when you would move to Germany, how the people in Germany would express their disagreement with your views. And you have to respect these cultural differences when you do business, but that doesn't mean that you compromise on important values.
You just mentioned now cultural diversity. Earlier you talked about trust. I was just wondering whether there's any empirical research been done on the relationship between trust and diversity in different cultures.
Well, usually heterogeneity is not good for trust. So on average, but probably there are exemptions. I mean, the more heterogeneous in terms of ethnicity, language, and so on, a country is, the tougher it is to develop trustful relations. But Switzerland is also a counterexample. I mean, Switzerland has a lot of trust despite 4 different language regions, but it also took many hundreds of years to grow together, so to speak. It didn't come overnight. But for example, when you want to solve a free rider problem and you have heterogeneity, economic heterogeneity, so some people benefit more from the public good than others, it makes it much more difficult to solve the free rider problem because you have conflicts of interests. And that means you have automatically less trust in other people's cooperation because everybody anticipates that it is harder to solve that problem. So yeah, the general thrust of the argument is it's harder.
We'll go with 2 more questions, Lay here, and then actually the speaker of this latest event tonight, Joe, will conclude.
My question goes to Professor Fehr. I'm interested in your paper. And my question is, you mentioned feedback and sanctions from the peers. My question is, this feedback, does it have to be in the form of a sanction? Does it have to be negative to work? And then the follow-up to that is, if one achieves cooperation that way, will that be a type of tyranny? Thank you.
Okay. Well, good question. First of all, no, it doesn't have to be a sanction. But let's say, I think there are many different ways in which we give feedback. And what is very important, that there are pro-social ways to give feedback and there are other ways to give feedback. For example, you could just remind people of that something that they agreed upon previously. I mean, there's so many things of giving feedback. It starts from smiling. You know, a smile can be very, very positive feedback, but a smile can be also very negative feedback, depending on how you smile and in which context you smile. And I think what I believe we need when we implement the feedback culture, we need to develop the right ways to give feedback, to give constructive feedback, so that it is not taken as a criticism, but that it is taken as a constructive way. And only the last mile, so to speak, when somebody is really stubborn and does not live up to the rules, then you have to go to sanctions. But before that, you start constructively, of course, and not with a sanction. But not giving positive feedback can also be viewed as a sanction, although we don't perceive it very often like that. But so, anyway, but you know what I mean, yeah.
Joe.
I guess I wanted to try to put together the earlier work by Professor Falk showing this great deal of cultural variation and the possibility that different management practices or peer punishment systems, punishing systems, might vary across societies. So the same management practices that might work in one place don't work or counterproductive. The same thing with types of punishment systems. Some kinds of peer punishment might work, whereas they might not work in other populations. So one piece of research that comes to mind is this experiment by Bandiera, in which he does 3 different incentive schemes, a piece rate, a daily wage, and a group piece rate. And she finds that you do it in England and you get the usual result, but if you do it in Africa or other places, the piece rate system doesn't work. And that would be the kind of typical thing you'd find in one of these management things. And Steve Heine, the cultural psychologist, shows that in Japan versus Canada, positive feedback works great with Canadians, but you got to use negative feedback with Japanese. So how you train has to be customized.
Yes. When it comes to management practices, I think incentives, precisely for the problems that were highlighted in Ernst's talk, incentives is probably the management practice that you don't want to, just blindly apply everywhere, because it lends itself to misinterpretations. It's very hard to specify the right incentives in team production settings. There is an issue of unobservability of output. So I think it's very tricky. As far as the practices that we look at, we actually looked empirically at whether the relationships between management and performance varied across countries, and we didn't find much variation. But I think it's because we are looking at very basic ideas that are less prone to being misinterpreted, if you like.
If I may conclude with a question to Simona. I know that you moved to Switzerland 9 years ago, am I right? And before that you were in Kia, Italy.
Yes.
So if you could give us an example actually of the difference corporate cultures in Italy versus Switzerland, some personal experiences. This is not being driven by the fact that 3 of our female economists today were...
That we should find a correlation
Italian,
between
yes.
the country and the fact that the 3
Yes.
Italian women are here today. So in terms of corporate culture, I can say that the corporate culture is so strong at IKEA that it is very easy for us to enter any office in the world and feel at home because the common behavior is very similar. And we are very much, resonating. Our personal values are resonating the company values. So this is not a big deal. However, since the culture is extremely inclusive, you can see different declination in terms of where you are operating. Now, it was a joke, but being sharp on time is super important at IKEA Switzerland. Whereas at IKEA Italy, if you just spend 10 minutes having a coffee together and start 15 minutes later, it's not a big deal. So this is still kept. No? But the 8 overarching values that I was describing still are everywhere.
I'm not going to ask where you're happier there versus here.
Well, I'm very happy.
Great. So I would like to thank the 3 participants and all of you for being here. And we'll see you after the next break. Thank you.